First of all, just a word or two about that menu of challenges and issues for discussion that you identified in those short but very comprehensive remarks that you made, Ivo, as you set the scene for our discussions. Clearly, we are facing challenges that are national, and from this part of the world, with its recent past history, people know what conflict and violence can mean for people's ordinary lives and for their ambitions and hopes for their families. And we don't need, I think, from this environment to tell people how important it is that we have a progressive view of the way in which we conduct ourselves in our international affairs. Although this city survived its most recent period of conflict, there are many reminders in the city itself of what that must have been like for those people who lived here. And weapons of mass destruction were not deployed here, but some of the worst inventions of humanity were employed in order to try and overcome the city's resistance only 20 plus years ago. So they are national, they are regional, and they're regional to this area, and you're encouraged in the introductory papers to think about the regional challenges that these issues pose. They are European-wide, Euro-Atlantic-wide, and global. The challenges we face and why we face them, and what contribution nuclear weapons make to those challenges, and potentially, if we discussions in relation to these weapons right, potentially how they can help us improve and address these challenges. So I'll concentrate on the geopolitical space that is known as the Euro-Atlantic area for a few minutes, if you don't mind. I think it's unarguable over the past 20 years or more, certainly since what we call the end of the Cold War, no geopolitical space in the world has undergone as dramatic a transformation as that between the Atlantic and the Urals. We may well be witnessing, in the Middle East and in North Africa, an equivalent development in terms of change, but time will tell, whether that is as dramatic. But historically, I don't think any space in the last 20 years has undergone the sort of change that has. As a result, the common interests of the greatest power in the world now, the United States, Europe and Russia, are more aligned today than at any point in modern history. During the Cold War, a devastating conventional and nuclear war in Europe was a very real possibility, and I think Ivo's remarks about the possibility of accident, never mind intent, in those circumstances with weapons at the kind of alert state they were at, was a very real possibility for many years. Today, Europe doesn't face this type of deliberate sort of existential threat. There's no question about that. Most people are comfortable with the idea that what we feared in the Cold War is unlikely to manifest itself. Relationships in the Euro-Atlantic region have dramatically improved, and European military forces, both conventional and nuclear, in all parts of Europe have significantly drawn down. There has been an amazing transformation in numbers, most particularly. But yet, there still is a corrosive divide on how nations perceive other nations in the Euro-Atlantic region. Part of my own personal history is that I was born in a small, nondescript town in the west of Scotland. In the post-war years, born in 1952, this was an environment, as most of Europe then was, which was dominated by the after effects of the worst conflict the world had ever seen. And thoughts of this must never happen again dominated the environment that I grew up in as a child. I mean, we were a relatively sophisticated but not wealthy community. But even then in the 1950s, despite the fact that the civic leaders of my community were those who had experienced the actuality of war for years across Europe, there was a recognition that we needed to move forward from that position. And I spent a significant part of my young days, my youth, my childhood in an environment in which institutionalized relationships with Germany were part of the norm. We twinned our towns with German towns. Civic leaders, many of whom had fought across Europe, went to enormous lengths in order to build trust and confidence, to remake relationships. In actual fact, to make relationships that had never existed before and pre-war didn't exist between our communities and others. Because there was a realisation that if we were to live together in this geographic space in the aftermath of war, despite the fact that people had experienced this war, then we needed to know and understand each other, and we needed to live together in more than just words. It struck me quite remarkably that that doesn't happen institutionally post, the end of the Cold War. I wonder why that is, particularly since, I lived most of my life in the city of London, where there is a very large Russian population. Not all of them, I may say, people whom we would have chosen to come and live with us, but they live there. I mean, most of them we would. Where, in the city of London, we trade every day billions of dollars worth of shares in Russian businesses, where we share on the boards of Russian businesses. We have Europeans, Brits, including, interestingly enough, a former Secretary General of NATO in a Russian company, and vice versa. And as I always say, because of London, we allow Russians to own substantial parts of our kind of cultural heritage. The Chelsea Football Club, which is very important to many people in the southeast of England, is owned, and I understand the New York Mets are too, owned by Russians. So, we are substantially integrated at one level, and in the high arts we've always been across Europe integrated quite deeply with Russians, but yet in the area of security and defence, we are remarkably aloof from each other. And we haven't really got down to dealing with the consequences of the challenge that faces us in trying to live in this rather small part of the world. So this corrosive divide in this geographical and political space that includes the European community of nations, Russia and the United States, is there because it's fueled by historical animosities, present-day uncertainties in the European security landscape, and in some instances, worst-case assumptions regarding military capabilities and operational doctrines. So this dialogue that is necessary is complicated by a lingering mistrust. This lack of trust is compounded by an extremely difficult menu of security issues: nuclear weapons, missile defence, conventional forces, cyber security. These are all vitally complex and related topics at the core of building a peaceful and secure Euro-Atlantic community. So my approach to this is that, in this world that we live in, we here in Europe have a significant responsibility, and one that I believe that over the 20 years since the end of the Cold War, we have singularly failed to bear properly. We have a tendency in our leadership at the highest levels to wait for Russia and the United States to show us the direction of travel. Studied, I think, ability to be able to present these great challenges of security, even for our own geopolitical space, as being the responsibility of other people, and a woeful failure to show the sort of leadership that I know that we could, and I am absolutely deeply persuaded that were we to take the burden of leadership that we in Europe should, that would move us in a distinctly different direction from the direction that we're in danger of moving in relation to almost all of these issues, because for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that individually and collectively, and this has become very apparent to us over the last couple of years, we simply do not have the money to continue to maintain the capabilities that we maintained in the latter part of the 20th century, and that we have to find other ways of securing our people and our way of life other than through the use of the most expensive and useless military hardware the world has ever seen. Having come to that conclusion, and having had the experience of high political office, and watched the dysfunctionality of many of our great multilateral institutions in trying to address these issues, I determined that when I got beyond the point of executive responsibility, that I would not wash my hands of this and walk away. I believe that we need to build the political capacity on all of the issues which Ivo has identified in the papers that he circulated and in his introductory remarks, and in particular the nuclear issue, which we tend in a studied fashion to avoid. And partnering beyond those political structures with other institutions like RUSI in London, with the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the Polish Institute of International Affairs, the Arms Control Association and others, we are combining political leadership with research and analytical expertise, and using this combination of skills to challenge strategic orthodoxy, to build public awareness and political capacity on disarmament issues particularly, and to perform a public education function. And I just want to depart from these notes here to make a point. Part of what we wanted to do with this, and we are now doing this to some effect, was to allow the diversity of European voices to be heard in Washington in particular. There is a tendency, and I have actually seen this in operation, for some of those in the political debate in the United States of America to misrepresent Europe. And where they recognise there is a diversity, they are lazy about that, in the sense that, you know, there's the famous speech about the old and new Europe. They tend to lump us together. In actual fact, Europe is an extraordinarily diverse place, and in my experience of travelling in it, and the more I get to know it, many of the countries in Europe are extraordinarily diverse places themselves. And there is a diversity of voices that covers the whole range of possibilities in many of these issues. And the appreciation of that, I think, with our greatest ally in this space, the United States of America, is crucially important to addressing these issues. They should not be allowed to play into their domestic politics part of that scenario of diversity in order to support whatever prejudice they may have. And we should deny them that opportunity by confronting them with the complexity of the decisions that we have to make. I don't exclude necessarily Russia from doing this, but the Russians are much more adept at understanding this difference, and in actual fact have a politics which exploits it in terms of their international relations and their relationships across the Euro-Atlantic area. They are much more subtle about it, and they understand it much better. Now, having come to that view and decided that I was going to address that, and confront some politicians with the reality of it, it then became apparent to me that actually we were guilty of that ourselves in Europe. But the more I got involved in this, and the more I travelled and engaged and brought politicians from one part of Europe to another, the more I realised that we didn't understand each other, and that we didn't actually understand each other well enough, and we didn't understand the pressures that domestic or others or regional that were on each other well enough to be able to have that sophistication ourselves. So we've spent a period of time in this network just building that capacity, never mind extending it to friends. Anyway, our intention is that the ELN will become a clearinghouse for expertise and political engagement on these issues, and that through our analytical research and educational work we will support parliaments who want help to work on the disarmament agenda. Now, and DCAF, I think, helpfully in considering the issue of democratic accountability for weapons of mass destruction, recently published a piece of research that shows a woefully inadequate parliamentary accountability across the world for those countries that hold some of the most dangerous weapon systems that human ingenuity has ever created. We just do not discuss these issues. I mean, you can put into the search engine for the United Kingdom Parliament the words ballistic missile defence, and you will get no response. And yet we have had 2 summits of NATO in which decisions have been made that the ballistic missile defence structure of Europe is to be not only created, but to be the focal point of the new relationship with Russia. And yet we don't discuss these at parliamentary levels. You know, we are at, once again, a point of enormous political uncertainty in this area. And in particular in both the United States and Russia, although we in Europe, you know, do not help this situation. The imminent US elections will inevitably change that environment, whatever the outcome are. You know, the post-election climate in Russia is an interesting environment, but how it settles and where its leadership takes it in relation to these important issues is very important. But there is a risk that in this concentration in domestic affairs in 2 countries that are most important to these matters, momentum will be lost to the extent that there has been any momentum recently on issues, particular issues of nuclear weapons.